You've surely seen this idea circulating. 6 pagan gods, sometimes 7, resurrected before Jesus. So his story is nothing more than a recycled myth. The claim appears in videos, in memes, in comment threads, always presented with the same tone, that of a historical fact, already verified, closed, and indisputable. No one questions it because it sounds like science, it sounds like erudition, it sounds like the kind of fact a believer cannot refute. But here's the uncomfortable question almost no one asks. Did anyone verify that list, fact by fact, source by source, before repeating it? Because a claim that circulates without anyone checking it stops being history and becomes something else. Exactly the same mechanism that Baruch Spinoza spent his life denouncing. Only this time it doesn't come from a pulpit, it comes from a screen. The idea that there is a universal pattern of gods who die and resurrect wasn't born on an ancient papyrus. It was born in 1890 in a British book called The Golden Bowl, written by James Fraser, a Victorian anthropologist who never stepped foot in Egypt, Phoenicia, or Anatolia. Fraser worked from his desk in Cambridge comparing missionary accounts and second-hand translations and proposed that almost every ancient religion revolved around the same agricultural archetype, a vegetation god, who dies in autumn and returns in spring. The book was a huge success, so influential that it shaped 100 years of comparative mythology and ended up becoming the source, almost always, without anyone knowing, of the list of 6 gods that circulates today in video after video. The question no one asks is simple. Did Fraser's method withstand the century of research that followed? And here, a fact worth mentioning is one rarely told about Fraser himself. His thesis was never accepted without resistance, not even in his own time. The Golden Bough was first published in 2 volumes in 1890, and Fraser expanded it edition after edition until it reached 12 volumes by 1915, with each one having more examples and less rigor in how he verified them. Even then, field anthropologists who had actually lived with the cultures he compared from his desk began to point out that he was forcing completely different societies into the same mold. Serious academic criticism began almost at the same time the book was becoming popular. The problem is that the criticism stayed in the universities, and the unifying myth stayed in popular culture, where it keeps circulating 130 years later as if no one had ever questioned it. The answer is no. And this isn't coming from a Christian apologist with a stake in the outcome. As Jonathan Z. Smith, one of the most respected historians of religion of the 20th century, states in a landmark article published in 1987 in the Cyclopedia of Religion, titled precisely Dying and Rising Gods, Smith reviewed Fraser's catalog case by case and reached an uncomfortable conclusion for anyone repeating the list without thinking. Several of those parallels are not as clearly attested as is claimed. Some were reconstructed by modern scholars themselves by stitching together fragments from different eras. And in more than one case, the element of resurrection only appears in late sources, some already written within the Christian world, not before it. This is not a fringe opinion. It is the position that ended up dominating the serious academic field for over 3 decades. This methodological problem already had a name even before Smith's article. In 1962, biblical scholar Samuel Sandmel, in a speech that became a mandatory reference, coined the term parallelomania to describe exactly this temptation. Finding 2 accounts with some superficial resemblance and jumping straight to the conclusion that one copied the other without checking dates, without checking if the resemblance is real or forced, without asking if both simply respond to common human concerns like death, the harvest, or the return of spring. Sandmel was not writing to defend any particular religion. He was writing as a historian, warning other historians that resemblance alone is never proof of direct dependency. 60 years later, that warning is still ignored every time a video reduces 6 different mythologies to a single weekend formula. Let's take the most cited case, Osiris. It is true that Osiris dies. He is dismembered and reconstructed by Isis. That is, as far as all the videos agree. But look at what almost no one tells you in full. Osiris does not walk among the living again. As if nothing had happened, he becomes Lord of the underworld, judge, and king of the dead. A permanent position in the realm of death, not a return to this life. Egyptologists themselves call this a transformation of state, not a resurrection in the sense a modern reader would understand it. When a video compresses that difference so that Osiris rises just like Jesus, it isn't summarizing, it is erasing the part of the myth that doesn't fit its narrative. And that kind of simplification, done over and over with 6 different gods, is exactly what Smith spent his career pointing out. Dionysus deserves his own separate paragraph because his case is older and more solid than those of Attis or Adonis. The Orphic gold tablets, buried with Dionysian cult, initiates date back to the 4th century BC, containing instructions for the soul in the afterlife and the promise of a divine life after death. That is several centuries before Christianity, without any ambiguity in the dating. What is more debatable is the specific detail that Dionysus rises from the dead in the strict sense. The most cited Orphic tradition describes him as twice born, not exactly as having died and returned to life in a recognizable human body. It is a subtle distinction, but it is precisely the kind of nuance that separates a serious comparison from a clickbait list. If Osiris is the most cited case, Attis is the most fragile, and also the most used because his story sounds almost identical to that of Jesus. Violent death, 3 days of mourning, celebration of returning life, right on the date when Holy Week falls today. The problem appears when you check the actual date of the sources. The texts that describe Attis literally resurrecting, not just mourned and remembered, but brought back to life, are late. The most explicit testimony comes from an author named Firmicus Maternus in the 4th century AD, writing in a world where Christianity had already existed for 3 centuries and was actively competing for the same converts on the same streets of Rome. That means something uncomfortable for the circulating list. There is no certainty that the resurrection of Attis influenced that of Jesus. It is perfectly possible that the influence ran the other way. With Adonis, a variation of the same problem occurs. The earliest ancient sources speak of his death and Aphrodite's mourning in detail, but the element of a full return to life, not just a division of time between the underworld and the surface negotiated by 2 goddesses, but a full resurrection, becomes clearer in later versions, already in the late Greco-Roman world. Comparing that smoothed-out late version with the resurrection of Jesus and presenting it as if it were the original form of the myth is the same methodological error that Fraser committed in 1890, repeated, without correction more than a century later, this time not in an academic book but in a video script. At the beginning of this video, I told you 6 gods, sometimes 7, and that 7th name deserves its own file, because it is the one that best demonstrates how far the viral list goes when no one checks it. Mithras, the Persian god adopted by Roman soldiers, appears in many expanded versions of this comparison, with a supposed birth date of December 25th and a supposed resurrection on the 3rd day. The problem is that neither of these 2 things is firmly attested in ancient Mithraic sources. The association with December 25th comes from a late Roman festival dedicated to the unconquered sun, only documented in the 4th century, and no known Mithraic text or relief describes Mithras dying and rising again. It is literally the weakest case on the entire extended list, and yet it is one of the most repeated. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider why so many of these festivals fall exactly in the same part of the calendar around the spring equinox. No theory of deliberate copying is needed to explain it. In the hemisphere where all these religions were born, the equinox marks the observable moment when the cold yields, the days grow longer, and the earth shows signs of life again after winter. Any agricultural people without contact with others has a practical and visible reason to celebrate precisely on that date. The calendar coincidence does not require a common origin. It only requires that different peoples looked at the same sky in the same field. This is where this video must be more honest than most of those attacking this list from the other side. The fact that Fraser's category is poorly constructed does not prove that Jesus rose from the dead, nor that his case is supernatural, nor that the Church is right about anything it teaches regarding that event. Smith did not write his critique to defend Christianity. He wrote it to defend historical rigor against any comparison made without verifying dates or sources, no matter where it came from. Discarding a bad comparison is not the same as confirming the miracle that the comparison intended to question. The two things are independent, and whoever mixes one with the other in either direction is committing the same type of rhetorical trick. It is worth asking why this simplified list continues to circulate without correction, and the answer does not favor only one side. Traditional Christian apologetics benefits from an exaggerated version that is easy to knock down because it allows them to present any religious comparison as a naive attack and appear as the reasonable party without having to review the actual work of historians like Smith. And certain skeptical content benefits from the same unrevised list because a bold and viral claim generates more clicks than a nuanced footnote. Both sides prefer easy certainty over complete investigation. The religious institution and the entertainment algorithm end up unintentionally on the same side, that of not complicating the story. A concrete example helps to see this without abstraction. In 2007, an internet documentary called Zeitgeist was released, seen by tens of millions of people, which presented Horus, Krishna, and Mithras as practically carbon copies of Jesus with specific details. Birth on December 25th, 12 disciples. Crucifixion, resurrection, on the third day, none of which any ancient Egyptian, Hindu, or Persian text supports. Egyptologists, Indologists, and historians of Iranian religions, none of them with any interest in defending Christianity, published detailed corrections pointing out that those specific parallels simply do not exist in the primary sources. And yet, more than a decade and a half later, the Zeitgeist list is still cited as if it were established scholarship. This is not an isolated case. It is the same dynamic we are dismantling here. Easy certainty travels faster than correction. And before we continue, it must be said with the same harshness toward the other side. Popular Catholic apologetics also does not usually cite Smith or Samuel. It prefers to respond to the entire viral list with a total denial, treating every parallel as pure modern invention without distinguishing the case of Tammuz, which is genuinely ancient and found within the Hebrew Bible itself, from the case of Attis, which, indeed, depends on a late source. Denying everything en masse is just as unrigorous as claiming everything en masse sauce. The institution that teaches that the resurrection of Christ is an unprecedented fact rarely stops to explain why the book of Ezekiel itself documents the same mourning for a dead God within its temple centuries earlier. That institutional silence is no coincidence. It is the same convenience that avoids complicating a story that performs better when it is simple. It is worth returning for a moment to Justin Martyr, because his reaction in the 2nd century reveals something important about this discussion. When early pagan critics pointed out the resemblance between Christ and these figures, Justin did not deny it. He openly admitted it and responded with a theory of his own. just as unverifiable as any modern viral list, that demons, knowing of Christ's coming in advance, had planted those stories in pagan religions to confuse future believers. It is a curious defense, because, to maintain it, Justin had to first accept that the resemblance was real and undeniable. Both sides of this discussion, those who exaggerate the list and those who deny it completely, have been using the same type of closed argument for nearly 2,000 years, designed to win the argument, not to understand history. The detail of the sanctuary of Cybele beneath Vatican Hill, which we already mentioned with Attis, deserves a second look here because it connects directly with the institutional question of this video. Archaeologists confirmed that sanctuary, called the Phrygianum, during 20th century excavations, exactly on the site where Catholicism's most important basilica stands today. It is not a minor geographical coincidence. It means that the institution that today teaches the absolute uniqueness of Christ's resurrection built its most important symbolic center literally on the ruins of a cult that celebrated a story of death and return centuries earlier. The physical overlap is as real as the narrative overlap this video has just reviewed. Let us then do the real count without exaggerating in either direction. Before closing the full file, Tammuz holds the weight of the comparison, attested to within the Bible itself. Baal holds it with a reasonable technical doubt as to whether it describes a personal resurrection or a climatic cycle. Dionysus is genuinely ancient, but his double birth is not the same as a resurrection in the strict sense. Osiris dies and returns, but to a different role, not to this life. Adonis and Attis depend on softened or late versions, and Mithras, the seventh name sometimes added, does not even have a clearly documented death and resurrection in his sources. Of 7 names, the full list is neither a myth invented from nothing, nor is it the solid and unanimous evidence promised by the video that repeats it without reviewing it. It is exactly what remains when someone does the full work instead of the easy summary. Spinoza never wrote about Attis or Jonathan Z. Smith. That must be said with total clarity because attributing that specific debate to him would be the same kind of invention this video is denouncing in others. What Spinoza does offer, and why it is worth bringing him to the stand again, is the method behind all of this. In the theological political treatise, he insisted that no claim about a sacred text, whether for or against, deserves to be accepted without first examining the language, date, author, and transmission of the source supporting it. That same standard, applied with the same rigor to a first-century preacher as to a 21st-century viral video, is the only thing that separates real research from propaganda, no matter which side is repeating it this week. And to be clear that this is not an isolated opinion within academia today, Smith's critique is what is taught as the standard position in most serious university programs of history of religions. It is not a dissident minority against a Fraserian consensus. It is exactly the other way around. Fraser's position is the one that remained as a 19th century relic, and Smith's is the one a comparative religion student finds today in any updated bibliography. The viral list of 6 or 7 gods keeps circulating on the internet, decades after the very field that originated it corrected it. There is an even deeper motive within Spinoza himself to understand why this same story appears time and again in cultures that never had contact with each other. In the first chapters of the theological political treatise, Spinoza explains that prophecy and religious imagination do not fall from the sky. They are formed by the language, customs, and concerns of the people who produce them. An agricultural people that depends on the cycle of planting and harvest to survive and faces death with no certainty about what follows does not need to copy another people to reach the same image. They only need to look at the same winter, the same buried grain, the same fear. The human imagination, when placed before the same conditions, tends to produce the same responses without the need for any plagiarism between religions to explain it. After all this correction, something real remains standing and deserves to be stated with the same clarity with which the rest was corrected. Tammuz, the Mesopotamian shepherd god, appears on Sumerian tablets millennia before Christ along with his annual mourning. The fields that dry up when he dies, the green that returns when he comes back, is documented in sources that no one can accuse of being written after Christianity because they are thousands of years older. But the piece of data that truly closes the case is another one. The prophet Ezekiel in chapter 8, verse 14 of the Hebrew Bible describes with horror women weeping for Tammuz at the very gate of the Jerusalem temple. That is not a pagan text speaking about itself. It is the Hebrew scripture documenting from within that the pattern was already circulating in the heart of Israel centuries before Christ. This case withstands Smith's criticism better than any other on the list, precisely because it does not depend on a late reconstruction. Baal, the Canaanite rival of Yahweh, deserves his own separate file because even within Smith's work his case generates more debate than the rest. The Ugarit tablets, written more than 1,000 years before Christ, tell how Baal dies devoured by Mot, the god of death, and how his sister Anat avenges him by cutting, burning, grinding, and sowing the remains of Mot exactly as grain is processed at harvest. Some specialists, including Smith himself in certain passages, argue whether this describes a personal resurrection of Baal or simply the seasonal cycle of rain and drought without Baal himself returning as a conscious individual. It is a technical difference, but an important one. Turning a climate cycle into a biography of resurrection may once again be the same type of simplification we already saw with Osiris. Even with that doubt open, the biblical pattern is undeniable. Elijah faces the prophets of this god on Mount Carmel, and the entire Old Testament treats him as a real rival, not as a distant legend. And here it is worth applying Spinoza's same magnifying glass to the two audiences of this debate, not just to the religious institution. The believer who needs Jesus' resurrection to be absolutely unique feels the same fear. Before this list that Spinoza described centuries ago, the fear of losing the foundation of their faith. But the viewer who shares the list of 6 gods without verifying it is also running away from something. From the slow and less satisfying work of reading a primary source, of checking a date, of accepting that the correct answer is sometimes "it depends." Instant certainty, whether it comes from a temple or a 10-minute video, is always more comfortable than thorough research. Spinoza offered no comfort to either side equally. He offered the same uncomfortable work to both. Now return to the question from the beginning. You were told that 6 gods resurrected before Jesus, with the same confidence with which others told you that his resurrection was unique and incomparable. Both versions were sold as closed certainties, and both, when reviewed source by source, turn out to be more fragile than they promised. Osiris is crowned king of the dead. He does not walk again among the living. Dionysus is born twice, but in a different sense than what the list simplifies. Attis and Adonis resurrect in softened or late-written texts. Tammuz, and with more debate, Baal do, hold the weight of comparison with genuinely ancient sources. And in the middle of those two easy certainties, only the method remains that Spinoza defended, with his own expulsion as the price. Check the date, check the source, and only then decide what to believe. If this type of verification seems more valuable to you than the easy list, subscribe to the channel. We continue to review with the same rigor every certainty that circulates without anyone having verified it.